Hello, it's June 20th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have international editor Yazan Al-Sadi.
Hello, from Beirut.
And journalist and reporter Louay Faur.
Hi, Hugo.
And on the pedestal these words appeared. My name is the News, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty in despair. On with the show. We've been off for a couple of weeks, and in the meantime, the news just did not stop. Yazan, you got something to tell us. What's been going on?
Yeah, so on Monday, 17th of June, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dissolved the six-member war cabinet after the departure from government of the centralist former general Benny Gantz. So this war cabinet was formed on October 11th after Gantz had joined Netanyahu in a national unity government at the start of the war. And it also included other partners in Gantz's coalition. So, last month, Gantz had given an ultimatum to Netanyahu on a six-point strategy regarding a post-war plan for Gaza, and said
what was that strategy? What did he want?
So he, to be very brief, he just wanted a very clear plan of who takes over Gaza after Hamas is gone, that all hostages are returned, that the PA plays a certain role, that certain domestic policies are taken. So he asked for these 6 points to be made by June 8th. Obviously, that didn't happen. Netanyahu ignored, so Gantz had decided to leave. Therefore, the very war cabinet that was formed for Gantz's sake
is that the only reason
gone.
why he's resigned? Because of these 6 points? Or are there other...
I mean, there is politicking, right? There's a lot of disputes that have been happening between him and Netanyahu in terms of how the war has been handled and just certain positions in terms of negotiations and domestic policies. So it's all coming to head. I think Gantz is trying to form an election because he believes that now is the time for him to take power.
Even without this, war cabinet, which now seems to have collapsed, the war does continue. So what does this mean for the war in Gaza?
Well, yeah. So on the military side, it's business as usual, right? The military will do what the military will do. They will continue to bomb and brutalize Gaza. At the moment, more than 37,000 Palestinians have been killed, mostly women and children. So the war is going to continue. Now, what this shows is basically the political instability among Israeli decision makers, which is kind of important, right, down the line. But what's going to happen is that there's going to be a wider commission, including the same people who were in the war cabinet, like Gallant and others.
The defense minister.
So it's a sort of musical. Yeah, the defense minister, exactly. So it's like musical chairs in many ways, just to get input into the cabinet. One interesting thing, though, is that Ben Gvir, the national security minister, and Smotrich, the finance minister, both extremists and fundamentalists, have been jockeying to join the war cabinet, but they haven't been included because it's, having such extremist people doesn't look good for the Israeli government, I suppose.
I mean, this is then probably pretty good for them, right? Because if there's no war cabinet to join, then they don't need to worry about trying to join it because it doesn't exist anymore. And I'm guessing they're going to have a bit more of a say in things now because they are part of the government cabinet.
They are part of the coalition. They are the spine of Netanyahu's coalition government, right? So without their support, the government would collapse. And one of the key things they want is a continuation of the war, not to have a certain deal, not to allow Hamas any sort of victory, and to, expand and just take more and fight and fight.
Talking of deals, I mean, there's been, over the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of talk of a ceasefire deal The US has been sort of touting it around the region. What is it? Briefly, I think what are the main points of it?
This was a ceasefire deal that Biden had presented last month in late May. Uh, According to the Americans, this is an Israeli proposal, and there are three phases in the deal. The first phase is a 42-day ceasefire with around 33 Israeli hostages released.
Mm.
And in turn, the Israelis are going to release 30 children and women, Palestinian hostages they hold. There should be an increase of entry of aid, a partial withdrawal of troops, free movement to the north, and a cessation of most of military flights and fighting. Then you have phase two that is supposed to happen after this 42 days, where there is a complete withdrawal of Israel from most of Gaza or all of Gaza. And there is the release by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups of Israeli reservists and some soldiers. And then phase three is a complete exchange of bodies, reconstruction, supposedly the ending of the blockade, the more than 18-year now blockade on Gaza, and some kind of complete deal. That is the gist of it.
Two points there that sort of spring to mind. One, that sounds a lot like a deal we've already heard previously, previous efforts to strike a deal. And two, those efforts have failed, so why might this work this time? It seems, is this, is history repeating itself? And very, very recent history repeating itself?
Yeah. Because history is cyclical, right? First as tragedy, now as farce, and then as farce again. This is a reiteration of previous deals as presented by Hamas and other parties.
Which didn't work.
And at the moment, Hamas had said that they accepted the broad outlines of the deal, but they've offered comments and amendments, particularly on two key points. One, that Israel commits to a complete withdrawal of Gaza and a permanent end of war. And two, that the U.S. provides written guarantees and that there are other stakeholders like China, Turkey, and the UN that plays a part to guarantee that a deal is made and followed through. Because as you said, in previous agreements, not even in recent history, even in the past year and before, deals are made, deals are broken, deals are bent,
Okay. Where are we with this deal now? That was end of May. We had a few weeks to talk about it. What the sides have they all agreed? Are they still negotiating? How close or far away are we from it?
Hamas had said that it accepted publicly the broad outlines, but there are these requests for amendments, sticky points. The Americans, for their part, say that the Israelis have accepted it because it's a quote unquote Israeli plan, but publicly, Israeli officials, including Netanyahu, the defense minister, IDF generals, aren't saying the same thing. They're saying the war will continue, that their goal is a complete destruction and dismantlement of Hamas, and so on, which it seems to be counter to the whole plan of negotiating and peace.
Doesn't sound like they're really interested in a ceasefire.
No,
I mean they haven't been.
Well, I think bluntly, if I can give you my professional and personal opinion, no, the Israelis clearly aren't interested in a ceasefire. We are looking at a situation of a plausible genocide, so we're looking at that rationale. I mean, there is no other way to discuss it, right? With the way they've conducted themselves so far, and even lately, right? If we're going to talk about a recent war crime, when they quote unquote rescued the hostages, right? For them, that was a successful operation.
On that point, it did happen while we were away. It was really quite a development, I think, for Gaza and for Israel's war in Gaza. What happened? Fill us in.
So on Saturday of last week, the Israelis conducted a so-called rescue operation on broad daylight, where they used an aid truck to enter into Nasiriyah camp in central Gaza and infiltrated into a building to rescue 4 hostages. In the process, more than 270 Palestinians have been killed, mainly women and children. Uh, there have been at least one recorded loss of life of an Israeli commander during the operation, and apparently reports show that it was kind of a huge, cluster mess of an operation. There was large indiscriminate airstrikes, and the UN called it a possible war crime. Uh, and Hamas claims that at least 3 other Israeli hostages have been killed, including one that is a U.S. citizen.
But during the rescue operation by Israeli forces?
Yes.
Not they haven't been executed in response.
No, in terms of like being hit by airstrikes that were shot indiscriminately into the area. Now, these airstrikes were called in because the rescue forces were pinned down by heavy gunfire. Their escape vehicle was destroyed by the Palestinian armed groups that were there. So they just called for a complete destruction of the area, and it killed more than 270 people. So as I noted, it is a possible and likely war crime as the UN investigates. What's interesting is that the Israeli captives that were returned have themselves called for a negotiated deal, because what it shows is that more lives are saved and released just by negotiation, right? Last time the Israelis released captives in a significant number was via a deal.
One of those captives who came out and said we should have a deal is now receiving death threats from other Israelis because of her comments.
The experience of the released captives is quite interesting, and audiences should read up about it. A lot of them have been abused or called even Hamas sympathizers or brainwashed for talking against Netanyahu's government or opposing war as a means to an end.
Protesters who have been protesting against the government in Israel I think this week were described as a branch of Hamas by one government official.
Yes. And it's not the first time, right? They've been these type of slurs happened quite a bit over the past 8 months.
It's an astonishing tactic by the Israeli government. I just got the article here. It was the deputy speaker of the Knesset, it's the Israeli parliament, who said this. I mean, he said, quote, "There are a few branches of Hamas, the fighting branch of wicked terrorists who murder children and the branch of protests." It's a bizarre statement, which I think really sums up the madness in all of this.
Yeah, and it plays into Netanyahu's favor, right? He's trying to stay in power as much as possible with the chaos that's happening amongst all the challenges in front of him.
And there are plenty of challenges.
Yeah, indeed.
Luay, you got a question?
Yes, Yazan. So Netanyahu is in hot waters, and he has been for quite some time now, since the start of the war on Gaza, and especially after his cabinet collapsed. And today his military is fighting on different fronts, including in Gaza and South Lebanon, and military operations in the occupied West Bank. How do you think all these developments in Gaza and growing challenges on the Lebanon front will affect these ceasefire talks? And do you think Netanyahu is capable of securing a deal despite the internal Israeli crisis and despite everything we've seen happen in the past few weeks?
So, to answer that question, there's 2 parts to it. First, yes, I think whatever happens on the ground, the battlefield will always determine the type of negotiations. I think part of why the war cabinet collapsed and a lot of hesitancy happened on the Israeli side in terms of launching a wider war on Lebanon is because of certain losses and challenges that they face on the ground in Gaza. They did not expect the level of sophisticated fighting and resilience that the various armed groups on the ground are showing. I mean, even till today, we're talking about after 250 days of intense bombing that has not happened, has surpassed World War II in magnitude. You still have armed fighters that are able to coordinate and launch sophisticated types of attacks, ambushes, hit and runs, launch mortars, rockets, and so forth. So this definitely has an impact on the type of negotiations, what the demands are, what the lowering the ceiling, I would say, and all that. Now, secondly, even with the challenges, could Netanyahu secure a deal? Most definitely. I think he could if he wanted to secure a deal. I mean, again, a lot of what we're seeing, as mentioned earlier, these proposals are iterations of proposals that were presented on day 2 of the war. So a deal was always on the table in some form. Now, Netanyahu does not want a deal. If there is peace, obviously, with all the challenges internally, he's going to court. His government collapsed. The immunities and charges he will face are there. Internationally, he has war crime charges now, whether it's on the ICC, there's the ICJ, there's domestic courts in Europe and elsewhere that are bringing up these things based on investigations by the UN itself. So he is a dead man walking in many ways. So he doesn't want to secure a deal. That's something that we need to take into account.
I feel that when it comes to sort of international diplomacy and diplomacy with the Palestinians, Netanyahu's had his cards laid out on the table pretty clearly from the beginning of this.
Yes, it's, again, what we mentioned earlier. Plausible genocide, so we're dealing with genocidal rationale. And that's where things are going.
Second story this week comes from you, Louay. What's been going on?
So for the past 8+ months, we've been witnessing very fierce border clashes between Lebanon, specifically Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel in parallel with the war on Gaza. We've seen very intense fighting, which has left hundreds killed in Lebanon, especially mainly Hezbollah fighters, but also children, journalists, paramedics. We've seen Israeli strikes in South Lebanon and elsewhere in the country, and we've also seen Hezbollah respond with missile and drone attacks in northern Israel. It's the worst fighting between the two sides since the 2006 month-long summer war. On June the 19th, during a speech, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah made a shocking statement when he warned Cyprus about letting the Israeli military use the island nation as a base for any possible future war against Lebanon, saying that the EU member would be considered a party in the conflict if this happens.
يجب أن تحذر الحكومة القبرصية.
The Cypriot government should be aware that the opening of Cypriot airports and bases for the Israeli enemy to target Lebanon would mean the Cypriot government is part of the war, and the resistance would deal with it as a part of the war.
وستتعاطى معها المقاومة على أنها جزء من الحرب.
In terms of Louay, in terms of the sort of the clashes and the violence, that's a big scale. There's a big scale there between small clashes and much major confrontations. This is mainly between Hezbollah, or maybe exclusively between Hezbollah and Israel. Yeah. What sort of scale are we dealing with here? What's been happening?
It's a scale unseen since the 2006 war between the two sides. There have been, skirmishes between Hezbollah and Israel since 2006. But since October the 8th, so a day after the Israel started its war on Gaza, Hezbollah basically began launching rockets onto Israel, saying that it was supporting Gaza and the Palestinians. And Nasrallah, the Hezbollah chief, has said on multiple occasions that the open front with Israel aims to disrupt their military activity in Gaza.
Okay.
Israel has obviously hit back hard and has targeted deeper into Lebanon, although the Israeli strikes have been largely limited to the border region, and we've seen several Lebanese border towns and villages along the Israeli frontier almost entirely flattened.
These are airstrikes as well.
Airstrikes, artillery, yeah. But we've seen on some occasions Israel strike deeper into Lebanon. So we had at the start of this year, Israel assassinated a senior Hamas official in a southern suburb of Beirut. There was obviously a lot of talk as early as this year saying that that strike could possibly be the last straw for Hezbollah, or lead to something much bigger between both sides. I mean, the so-called rules of engagement have long been broken between both sides, but as I've mentioned, things are still largely quote-unquote contained, but Israel has been striking deeper into Lebanese territory, targeting what they say are Hezbollah warehouses, sites, commanders, and other groups as well, because alongside Hezbollah we have other Lebanese Shia and or Sunni and Palestinian factions fighting alongside Hezbollah. But Hezbollah obviously is
they're the big ones.
Yeah.
This week we heard that Israeli plans had been approved for some sort of operation in Lebanon. Do we know what those plans were? Do we know what the scale of those plans were? And then sort of what does that actually mean in practical terms?
So we don't know much. I mean, not much information has been revealed on these plans, but on Tuesday evening, they quote-unquote approved and validated plans for an offensive in South Lebanon. This actually was announced just hours after Hezbollah shared footage from a drone that they say they sent over the port city of Haifa in Israel. Haifa's home to Israel's largest port. It's home to obviously a lot of their military sites. Yeah. The drone, according to Nasrallah, took hours of footage of different civilian and military infrastructure over the city and its surroundings. I mean, this was a major development in the border conflict. Hezbollah's already sent hundreds of drones into Israel. Some of them have successfully achieved what they were sent for, and some of them have been taken down by Israel. But it seems that the developments we've seen recently in the past few weeks have definitely taken a very dramatic turn.
Do we think that is there an inevitability about an Israeli ground assault on Lebanon, or is there space for let's say both sides to step back from this, or is it all dependent on Gaza?
So Hezbollah has made it very clear that they will not stop their attacks on Israel until a ceasefire in Gaza is reached. The US is leading mediated negotiations between Israel and Lebanon to try and reach a settlement between the two sides. Hezbollah has completely rejected any attempts for a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel until the war in Gaza ends. But answering your question on is this inevitable, nobody actually knows. Nobody's sure, but it remains very likely. Although Israel has been threatening to launch an invasion or a full-scale war in Lebanon for many months now. But both sides know that this war will be very costly. Israel knows that any large-scale attack on Hezbollah or war in Lebanon will be met with a very fierce response from Hezbollah. They know that the consequences on Israel will be dire.
It's not going to be the same, is it? Yazan was talking about how Palestinian groups within Gaza still have the capacity to inflict casualties in Gaza. I mean,
So we can imagine Hezbollah's capabilities.
Hezbollah's capabilities is going to be much greater, surely.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the same sort of war for them, no?
Yeah, I mean, Hezbollah has been surprising us with, their military capabilities. I mean, the types of missiles they've been using, the drones they've been using. Again, Nasrallah himself has said that we will, quote unquote, surprise the Israeli enemy, and we have a lot of things up our sleeves, and what we've used so far is only a small percentage of what we actually own. There was a belief that Hezbollah had an arsenal of around 150,000 rockets. There were reports the other day saying that Hezbollah could own up to 1 million rockets. So
that's a big range.
Yeah.
I mean, anything between those two numbers is big.
Yeah.
I think this is maybe sort of the biggest question of them all is, will Israel be allowed to invade Lebanon? Which is to say, would the US support an invasion? Or, we've seen US red lines in Gaza, and they are worthless.
Yeah, exactly.
This is, I feel, as the sort of 64,000
question. Netanyahu and the Israeli officials, they're unhinged, and like you said, the red lines in Rafah have proven to be worthless. I think the same would apply in South Lebanon. Netanyahu has crossed every single red line. He's gone against anything the US has advised him on in Gaza, but the US has made it very clear since October, since the cross-border clashes started with Hezbollah, that they do not wish to see a greater war in the region, especially with Hezbollah, especially in Lebanon. And this is at least from what we've heard from US officials. As I mentioned, the US and France are leading negotiations to try and find a longer-lasting settlement between Lebanon and Israel. But both sides don't seem to be backing down. Both sides, I mean Israel and Hezbollah. Israel is adamant on pushing Hezbollah away from the border. Hezbollah has refused and saying that they are standing their ground, will refuse any deal before the war in Gaza ends. Whether Israel will invade or not, we're not sure. But Hezbollah has made it very clear that they're prepared for any future conflict.
Hezbollah is not Lebanon, as Lebanon is not Hezbollah. They are sort of separate. What has Lebanon, the Lebanese government, been saying about this? Because an Israeli invasion is going to, not only target Hezbollah, it's going to hit everywhere. So,
I mean,
what's the Lebanese government been saying?
I mean,
about
as always, this is very complicated, and it's the reason why Lebanese society is so deeply divided between those who support what Hezbollah is doing and between those who believe that Hezbollah is acting as an Iranian proxy and dragging Lebanon to a conflict that Lebanon shouldn't be a part of. I mean, as always, Hezbollah chose to go to war with Israel in October without consulting anyone. The Lebanese government has had very little to no say in what's going on. Hezbollah is acting as the government and as Lebanon's military, and the most.
It's far better equipped than Lebanon's military.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the Lebanese military is very ill equipped. They're incapable of confronting the Israelis. I mean, as a part of the negotiations happening, mediated negotiations happening between Lebanon and Israel, is that France and the US and other powers are willing on deploying more peacekeepers in South Lebanon, funding the Lebanese military, deploying more Lebanese troops in South Lebanon. But in terms of what does Lebanon think, or what does the Lebanese government think, and what they're saying, the Lebanese government, as I said, they've had little to no say in what's going on. Of course, Lebanese officials are condemning what Israel is doing. They're calling on the international community to try and put an end to Israel's crimes and Israel's strikes in South Lebanon. Hezbollah is calling the shots. It's Hezbollah who decides whether to continue with this war or not. But Hezbollah themselves has said they don't want to see an escalation, but again are prepared if an escalation does happen.
I think it's fair to say that within Israeli society there's, let's say, broad support for the war in Gaza. they feel particularly aggrieved about what happened on October 7th, when so many people were killed and taken captive. Is there the same sort of support do we see the same sort of support amongst the Israeli population for a war in Lebanon?
There is, and this support is growing day by day because tens of thousands of Israelis have been forced to leave their homes in northern Israel. We just had a story this morning. A Palestinian town in northern Israel, its residents were evacuated. It's just a few kilometers away from the Lebanese border. So much of northern Israel, similar to South Lebanon, has been emptied of its residents. The Israelis are saying they're sick and tired of the situation. They want to return home, but obviously they're worried of an October 7th like scenario happening with Hezbollah, possibly storming northern Israel. A recent poll actually by the Jewish People Policy Institute surveyed about 800 people, and it showed that 60% of the people they spoke to said that they wanted Israel to attack Hezbollah with quote-unquote full force, and more than a third of them said that they wanted this to happen as soon as possible, even before operations in Gaza end, because Israeli officials have been saying that we need to finish Rafah, we need to end the war in Rafah, and then we can focus on South Lebanon. But many Israelis, especially from northern communities, northern settlements, are saying, just go in now and just dismantle Hezbollah, push them back away from the border because we want to return home.
Yazan, you had a question.
So last time Israel went to war against Lebanon Hezbollah was in 2006, so 18 years ago. And we're approaching that anniversary now. If possible, in your opinion, and if you can speculate, if a war does happen, how would it be similar or different to the last one?
I really think that any war this time would be very different to anything we've ever seen before between Hezbollah and Israel. Hezbollah, and just recently in his latest speech on June the 19th, Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, repeated his threat of storming the Galilee in northern Israel. He said that any future conflict will see Hezbollah entering the Galilee, and I think an invasion of the Galilee would completely change everything. It would alter everything in this conflict. The Lebanese know, and Hezbollah knows, that Israel is capable of inflicting widespread destruction in Lebanon. They can target the airport, they can target our roads, our infrastructure, similar to what they did in 2006. But I think Hezbollah actually being in northern Israel, if they act on their threats, will change everything. And I mean, in warfare, Hezbollah tends to act on its promises and its threats. When Hassan Nasrallah says that Hezbollah is going to do something, sooner or later, they do it. And I think we'll see surprises. But the end goal to all of this, in my opinion, won't be, just a temporary truce, or just basically, Israel pulling back and Hezbollah pulling back. I think what the US wants, and what both Lebanon and Israel want, is a lasting settlement, a longer lasting, possibly a peace deal, ending the border disputes between both sides. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Benny Gantz, who was in Netanyahu's war cabinet, who resigned. He said that at the end of any possible conflict with Hezbollah, we are going to have to sit down and negotiate and reach a settlement. So I think whatever happens in any scenario, the end goal is reaching a settlement, and possibly a permanent settlement between Lebanon and Israel.
The prospects of such a settlement like that seem so distant with the current leadership on both sides.
At the moment, yes. At the moment, yes.
Final story from me this week. Millions of Muslims from around the world have been undertaking Hajj, a sacred Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Amid the acts of religious devotion, hundreds of people have died in the extreme heat. Aruz Fahaj, a Pakistani pilgrim, said this to reporters.
Yesterday, most of the people, they died on the roadside, and some were fainted due to the heat and heat stroke. So they should make such arrangements that during the summer season, when the Hajj season is in the summer, they should arrange a bit transportation for the whole.
So it sounds like it's been very hot there in Saudi Arabia. How hot? What was the temperature like?
It's been real scorchers. The National Meteorological Centre reported a high of 51.8 degrees Celsius, which is, for our Fahrenheit listeners, 125 degrees. That was recorded at the Grand Mosque in Mecca earlier this week. There was a Saudi study that was published last month that said that temperatures in the area are rising by 0.4 degrees Celsius each decade.
Do we know how many people have died so far?
As of today, Thursday, the 20th of June, over 1,000.
Wow.
I mean, it is a lot of people. Most of the deaths are related to extreme temperatures. Officials have said that it would seem that the vast majority of these people have come from Egypt. At least 658 of the dead are from Egypt. In total, there have been around 10 countries that have reported pilgrims who have died. There was one person who was killed during a minor crush in a crowd, but heat exhaustion is the main cause.
That's a crazy figure.
It is a crazy figure. I mean, also, more than half of those who have died have been what are described as quote-unquote unregistered worshippers, right?
Mm.
The Saudi government controls Hajj. They have the Minister of Hajj. They tightly regulate the number of Hajj visas that are distributed and available each year. This is a sort of an attempt to prevent overcrowding at the sites. However, each year they get hundreds of thousands of unregistered pilgrims. These are the people who don't have a Hajj visa. If you don't have a visa and you're unregistered, you are not eligible to go into air-conditioned areas that have been put on by the government and things like this. So the Saudi authorities have blocked these people. They're all stuck outside, and then
which has contributed to
their heat exhaustion,
yeah.
And that's resulted in them dying. I mean, there was an Arab diplomat. He spoke to AFP, and he said that people were tired after being chased by security forces. So the security forces went in, found unregistered Hajj visitors, and then chased them off, which made them very tired. And, they subsequently died of heat exhaustion. Saudi Arabia has not provided information on fatalities, although it has reported more than 2,700 cases of heat exhaustion, but hasn't reported on fatalities.
So what's been the reaction so far? You mentioned various countries, 10 countries. Any reactions?
Yeah, not good. People are pretty angry about this. A country like Jordan, specifically, they've been very angry there. What's really riled people up, frankly, I mean, people dying is tragic and it shouldn't happen. What's really riled people up, it would seem, is how they've dealt with the deaths of pilgrims without permits. It all ties back to a comment by the Minister of Al-Kaf, who said that, quote, all the official Jordanian pilgrims are fine. The minister has no stats on the unofficial pilgrims. Now, all Jordanian pilgrims were not fine. Some were dead. But all official ones, by the Saudi standards, were fine. This angered a lot of people because they're like, well, official or unofficial, you should, really have responsibility for these people.
I mean, especially with all the money that they spend.
It's a huge amount of money. It costs, the prices that people are spending is between $3,000 and $10,000 per visit, which is a lot of money. The average annual salary in Jordan, in a country like Jordan, is about $10,000. So if you're spending your entire salary on a trip, and then you end up dead because you're not allowed into an air-conditioned room, it's a pretty rum deal. The director of the National Society for Human Rights in Jordan, he told our sister publication, Al Arabiya Jadid, quote, "The presence of irregular pilgrims doesn't exempt the Minister of Al-Kaf from responsibility." He added that it was, quote, "unacceptable to talk about these pilgrims this way, as though he is unconcerned with them and they are outside his political and moral responsibility."
So Hajj this year is taking place as Israel's war on Gaza continues into its 9th month. Has that impacted the annual pilgrimage in any way?
So obviously there's a lot of people in Gaza who would have liked to have undertaken pilgrimage who can't. It was reported that the closure of the Rafah crossing had prevented 2,500 Palestinians from travelling to Saudi Arabia to perform pilgrimage. I imagine the total number of people who would have gone, if not for the current circumstances there, would be much higher. The sort of main talking point about the war in Gaza in relation to the Hajj was they were asking people not to talk about the war in Gaza. So on June 7th, which was just before sort of the Hajj period started, Saudi Arabia's Minister for Hajj said that the kingdom would not allow, quote, political slogans to take place during Hajj. He went on to say that the Hajj is, quote, known to be a form of worship, and we are keen to ensure peace so that everyone can perform their rituals with ease. Now, that was a pretty vague statement to make, and that a lot of people questioned the vagueness of that statement. In response to the backlash from this, with a lot of people getting very angry about this because they feel very strongly about what's happening in Gaza and what's happening to, certainly as they see it, their Muslim brothers and sisters. The official news account of the Hajj said that, quote, "Making dua for Palestinians, especially our brothers in Gaza, is not banned. This is completely false. What is banned is raising political slogans, be it from any country or region. Only the remembrance of Allah can be raised in the two holy mosques." That all being said, the Imam of Mecca's Great Mosque did also, during one of his sermons, call on pilgrims to pray for the Palestinian suffering amidst Israeli bombardments. He said, quote, "Pray for our brothers and sisters in Palestine who have been touched by harm and have suffered from harm." So I think Saudi Arabia does seem to be walking a very fine line of trying to ensure that this doesn't become a mass sort of protest moment in Saudi Arabia.
Prior to this year's Hajj, and you touched a bit about this in terms of all the money the Saudi authorities threw at this year's events. But prior to this year's Hajj, the authorities also held an unprecedented military parade to showcase the large number of security forces and tech that they're deploying and using. But with such a large amount of deaths so far that happened, is the solution to the problems related to Hajj really security oriented?
So they really upped security at the Hajj after 2015. There was a stampede, maybe you remember. Yeah. There was a stampede there which killed, I think, it was about 700 people died in the stampede. It was a real tragedy, and that was, a lot of the blame of that was placed on sort of bad planning and things like this, and a lack of security. Since then, the security has gone up. Will security solve the problems? No, because the problems isn't a lack of security. The problem is climate change. I mean, it's a mixture of climate change, everything's getting hotter, and it so happens that Hajj this year falls in June, and June in Saudi Arabia is a particularly hot time, and even hotter with climate change. I mean, you could solve the problem perhaps if you took all the soldiers and you took away all their guns and say gave them, I don't know, like hand fans and brollies to hold over people. But that's about all you could do with them. There's no real security. You can't shoot the sun, although you could try, but it just wouldn't work. Lots of other news has been happening while we were off for a couple of weeks. One here. Germany designates BDS movement as extremist group. Germany on Tuesday designated the pro-Palestinian boycott, divestments, sanctions group as a quote extremist movement. Decision came following a report last year by Germany's domestic intelligence agency saying they were suspected of extremism. This seems utterly mad. Yeah. Why has Germany done this?
I mean, Germany hasn't shied away from its unwavering support for Israel before and during the Gaza war. There has been a wide crackdown on any sort of anti-Israel sentiment. Their excuse, as usual, is that this is, quote, anti-Semitic. They've gone after a lot of pro-Palestinian activists. So anything they deem to be harmful to Israel or very critical of Israel is basically being silenced. So I think their decision to designate the BDS as an extremist movement isn't anything new. And I think the German parliament was the first European parliament a few years ago to also pass certain legal measures as well, targeting BDS.
In 2019,
Yeah.
2019
So,
Parliament approved a resolution denouncing
Yeah.
BDS.
So this isn't their first time, going after the pro-Palestinian and non-violent movement.
Yazin?
And, Germans have a knack in finding themselves in, the wrong side of history time and time again. So it's part of that time-honored German tradition.
Like Bratwurst. Another one here. Barclays ends UK festivals sponsorship over Israel link backlash. Barclays said Friday it has suspended its sponsorship of several leading UK music festivals after an artist-led backlash against the bank's provisions of financial services to defence companies supplying Israel. This seems to be like quite a common theme this summer with festivals, be it either music or literary or other forms of art. I mean, this seems to be that Barclays is now just withdrawing funding from the arts, but continuing its financial support for companies to support Israel. So does that mean it works? Seems like this is the worst outcome, really.
It's yes or no. I mean, it shows that BDS is a powerful tool, social mobilization, and to, impact companies and governments to change things. And it's a work in progress, right? Not all things will be complete victories, but it clearly shows that BDS is a threat to companies like Barclays. I would say it really depends on what's the next step, right? Because it just doesn't stop here. And we'll see what the organizers and campaigners do next on Barclays until it changes completely. And hopefully it doesn't just stop on Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
I mean, Barclays is renowned for investing in a lot of horrible things throughout the world, right? So here's to more ethical business, if possible, in capitalism. That's, I think, the biggest question.
He's hoping.
I mean, we've seen an unprecedented level of support for Palestine. It's I think the Gaza war has risen awareness globally, and I think this is just the natural result of what we've been seeing with pro-Palestinian solidarity, the pressure being exerted on these big firms. And
as I said, I think it will be better when these sorts of pressure campaigns do result in them not providing support for Israel and continuing funding the arts. I think that would be the ideal outcome. I'm not
ideally.
I don't know how I feel about this really. There's another story. This was today. This happened. Iran says Canada terror designation for Gaza is hostile. Iran on Thursday condemned as, quote, irresponsible and, quote, hostile a decision by Canada to designate the country's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist entity. Given Iran's the IRGC's role in the downing of that passenger plane, flight PS 752. That was back in January 2020. This might help get some justice and resolution for the Canadian victims of that, of which there were a lot. Yazin.
Possibly. I mean, I don't think the Canadian government is really concerned about actual justice for the Canadian victims. It's more of a political pressure point as it's aligned to the U.S. foreign policy in terms of Iran and, Canada's support of Israel. It definitely is trying to play into that, but it has nothing to do with actual justice, I would say. And I mean, the bigger question now is, okay, what about enforcement? Because Canada, interestingly enough, is a weak country. Don't forget that not long ago, India carried out assassination in Canada and was able to get away with it. And the Canadian government tried to appeal to, its allies in the UK and US to condemn India, and that was not possible. Now, Iran is easier. They all agree that Iran is the great evil to them. So there could be some low-level pressure, but nothing like extraordinary like justice for, victims of what happened there with the downing of the plane.
Some great stuff out on the New Arab's website this week. Yazin, why don't you give us yours first?
So I got this great piece that I read. It's in the opinion desk, and it's titled Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's new president is no pal of Palestine. It's written by Simon Rodriguez Porras, and it's a critique of Claudia's role to come, taking into account what her positions were politically in the past. And it's definitely a rarity in this day and age. A lot of people, when she won in Mexico, really celebrated and lionized her as, the second coming of, Palestinian support in Mexico. But I think Simone here pours very practical, smart, cold water to that, hype. And it's worth reading.
Louis?
So, is Turkey gearing up for a new offensive against Kurds in Syria? Paul Iden writes, Turkey has said that the Kurdish-led administration's decision to hold elections is unacceptable, but is another military operation likely? Turkey has carried out military operations in Syrian territory at least 3 times in previous years, in 2016, 18 and 19. They deem Kurdish groups in Syria, namely the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a coalition of different groups, as a terrorist organization. The SDF controls more or less all of eastern Syria, or at least east of the Euphrates. So the Turkish government and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been threatening a new incursion in Syria. So we are yet to see if there will be any developments on that front in the coming months.
I've got one from me from the opinions desk. It's actually our opinions editor, Benjamin Ashraf. He's got a good piece. Pakistan cricket's World Cup woes mirror its soap opera politics. It's an excellent piece about Pakistan's humiliating defeat in the T20 Cricket World Cup at the hands of the United States, which, if you didn't watch that game, it was a good one. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by Yazan Al-Sadi and Louay Faour. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Until then, if you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. Or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.